Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm here today to speak with an expert on an issue that is very important right now that's been all over the news, and we're going to get into all that. Before we do, I want to introduce my guest. To my left is the esteemed professor at Yale. He's written a couple of very good books. Actually, I have two of them here. No, what a coincidence. One is The End of Myth, and America, which he just came out with recently. Yeah, that's right, I got to pronounce it correctly. But not to brag or anything for you, but End of Myth won the Pulitzer Prize. So just to give you guys a little heads up what we're dealing with. This is Greg Grandin. How you doing, Greg? Nice to see you. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having us. So, I mean, we might as well just jump right into it. This past weekend, actually, was, there was the protests against the ICE raids in LA. The National Guard is called in for the first time since the 1960s over a governor's wishes. Your book, End of Myth, kind of deals with this subject a little bit. I was hoping we could just start from there. What do you think? What do you think about everything?
Yeah, well, End of the Myth deals with it quite a bit.
Yes.
It is about the rise of a kind of nativist politics, trying to explain the ascent of Donald Trump and trying to, the abstract argument is that, the nation, the United States, more than any other nation, is founded on the promise of limitlessness, whether that be the frontier or whether that be markets, but just, constantly growing and movement. In some ways, it's kind of overlaps with capitalism. No nation more seamlessly corresponds to the abstract workings of capitalism in the United States, in the sense of it has to grow to survive, to thrive.
And just to clarify, that myth you're talking about in the book End of Myth is that limitlessness.
Yeah, is that limitlessness.
It's the frontier.
The frontier. The frontier is to be more concrete, is when Donald Trump, made the wall building a wall, a central part of his campaign promise. And I realized, he's substituting the frontier for the wall as the organizing myth of American nationalism.
Right.
And what does that mean to go from the frontier, which promises limitlessness, to a wall which embodies, shutting it down and immobility. And the argument is that the United States had enjoyed the privilege and luxury of being able to organize its domestic politics by constantly promising limitlessness and growth, whether it be landed frontier, whether it be markets, whether it be righteous war for humanity. And it was able to organize its domestic politics. It was able to reconcile contradictions. It was able to buy off constituencies or, overcome contradictions among constituencies and for new political coalitions. And there was the way the advancement of liberal reform took place as a result of, often through the promise of opening markets.
In your book, you referred to it as a safety valve.
It's a safety valve also for, we became addicted a little bit to the war, the idea, what do you do with the trauma that was generated by the last war? You roll it back into the next war. But the wars, the United States is still waging wars and it still has military bases all over the world. But when I wrote the book, I was thinking about three things that kind of ended that frontier for good. One was the disastrous war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the United States is still an empire, but it lost the kind of righteousness, right? It's no longer a war for humanity that the United States is waging. And then, of course, the economic collapse of 2008, and then climate change. These three things kind of shut down the ability of the United States to use the promise of limitlessness to organize its domestic policy. So the extremism that was always cast out or kept at the margins now became central, and that explains the rise of Donald Trump. Right.
And it's been a gradual process coming back inward.
Yeah, it's not anything that happens like this. And Donald Trump is not, it has long tendrils in U.S. history, but the U.S. has long been able to resolve its political conflicts and within a two-party system, except for the Civil War. Right. And what you have a series of realignments, and they all take place within a two-party system. And extremism is kept either at the margins or it's cast outward. And the United States no longer has that ability. The furies now kind of swirl around the homeland. And what was considered marginal comes to center stage with Donald Trump. And Trump doesn't so much initiate many new policies. He wasn't the one, and we can get into this, that began the militarization of the border or the militarization of immigration policy that, has a long bipartisan history. But he's the first one to kind of make it a spectacle.
Right.
Right. To make
centralize
it.
As like a center.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Right.
And if you go back to the 70s, there were a number of people. One of them was John Crutzen, a journalist in the New York Times who wrote on immigration. And even in the 1970s, he said, look, these politicians that are promising to seal the border, it's an unsealable border. It's a 2,000-something mile border over some of the roughest terrain, separating the richest country in world history from a relatively poor country. And there's no way you're going to seal it. But what you're going to do is you're going to create the conditions for the increasing militarization. If there is, and Crutzen and others said, if there is a militarization of society, it's going to come as a result of border policy. And I think that is what we are seeing in California, what we're seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, right. And in the book, you spoke about how it really is, too, it's an impossible task because you're basically trying to go against history as well.
Yeah.
There was the Jen Napolitano's quote where it's like, show me a 50-foot wall, I'll show you a 51-foot ladder.
Yeah.
Without addressing NAFTA and all these things and the effects these things had, it's a losing fight.
And up until 1917, really, or up until World War I, the border was more or less porous. People came back and forth. And the Southwest, and by the Southwest I mean the United States and Mexico, is largely a single economic zone. Mining, extractive industries, U.S. capital was in northern Mexico. People went back and forth and worked. Domestics went back and forth and worked. And that went on for a while. You saw a progressive tightening of the border after World War I.
Right.
In 1970s, with the defeat in Vietnam, there is a rise of domestic nativism focused on the border. But it's nothing compared to where we are now.
Right.
But you start to notice it. You start to see it. And the United States starts to bring back a lot of that military equipment and bring it to the border.
Yeah.
And, the census and things like that. And a lot of defense contractors that had contracts for military equipment in Vietnam now we're getting contracts on the border. And so you see that process just expanding exponentially. Now, you add to that the politics of NAFTA, which happened in the 1990s, and what NAFTA symbolizes, whether we want to call it globalization, whether we call it neoliberalism, whatever we want to call it. But Bill Clinton, for instance, he's the president that signed NAFTA into law. He's also the president that began in full the militarization of the border.
Right.
Not a Republican, it was Bill Clinton, because they knew that NAFTA would do two things. One, it would have a devastating effect on the class structure in the United States, but also, aside from that, it would throw peasants off the land in Mexico. This would start the flooding of Mexico with cheap corn from Kansas. So within a couple of years of NAFTA in effect, 5 million peasants were thrown off the land. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Mexico. Many of them came to the United States. So Clinton, even though the two policies weren't connected, simultaneously put NAFTA into effect and then began the militarization of the border. And Clinton especially wanted to shut down relatively safe crossing zones, urban crossing zones, where people came back and forth I worked in restaurants in the 1980s. And, there were people in the kitchen that lived from Puebla. Where you going now? I'm going back to Puebla. I'll be back in a month. They went back and forth. They expected to be able to go back and forth.
There was a volleyball game that took place over there was about one side of it.
I know, but that being able to go back and forth stops because Clinton militarizes the state and they want to force people into the desert. They want to use geography. His INS secretary specifically said we want to use geography as a deterrent, meaning making it difficult. They thought people wouldn't go into the desert and suffer, but of course that's not true. And it also had the effect of locking people in the country because you couldn't go back and forth, right? So that was Clinton, and that basically continued from Clinton forward. And the Democrats, Clinton didn't make it a political issue. He just like he made crime and welfare reform a political issue. But most Democrats went along with the militarization of the border without necessarily turning it into a political performance.
Right. Well, and that's in your book. You also mentioned how Clinton was actually one of Reagan's biggest victories. Was that he created Clinton?
Yeah.
He brought the Democrats over to kind of the right, and so everything since has been kind of this compromise at best. At worst, basically more the same. You know?
Yes. So by the time you get to Trump, you really have a complete. You have a different political. Trump gives a name and face to processes that were occurring kind of more subterraneous.
And he elevates them. And he makes them a center part of his...
hence the wall, right? You know, he wasn't the first person to build a border blockade. That started in 1948, but it really continued under Clinton. Clinton put up all of these Vietnam landing pads around San Diego. Again, it's almost like the detritus of the United States' empire is coming back and concentrating itself on the border. So what you're seeing in California now in Los Angeles and this the performativity of ICE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost kind of an expansion of the border too. There was a great quote where they interviewed, I guess, one of the founders of the Kansas City Border Watch or something, and he says, they asked him, where exactly are the boundaries of the American homeland? And he says, all over America. Yeah. So what it is basically now is just this, it's not just policing the border, it's policing the border everywhere in the country. Yeah. And it's expanding that and militarizing that now. Yeah.
And that's schools that's what ICE is doing, right? Because people aren't coming in, they're not accepting asylum claims. Right. They're turning people away, which is illegal according to U.S. law. But setting that aside, a lot of the raids are taking place deeper in the country, deeper into the United States, and that's what some of these people predicted, that if you start going after immigrants in the workplace, you're going to create a domestic secret service, or just domestic Gestapo, as John Crutzen calls it, and that I think is what we have with ICE. Yeah,
and then you eventually expand that out to people who speak out for them, to people who protect them, to people who are trying to,
and then political protesters when it has to do with, when it has to do with Gaza, or Chilean tourists. That wealthy Chilean and her daughter were walking down the street in New York, and he's got unbelievable.
I mean, it's great. I mean, it's great how I guess dead on your book really kind of hits that question of the frontier and this. I guess basically the evolution of the concept of frontier to the point where we hit this limit as a country and it kind of comes right back. Yeah. And looking for ways to expand out, whether it's through capitalism or neoliberalism or wars in Central America and all that, but also with the border itself.
Yeah. I think Gaza is a good example of like you can't use war anymore as a way of like overcoming domestic. It just creates of muting domestic polarization. It just deepens polarization, right? Gaza is like this albatross around the democratic. I mean, it's a lot of things, and I don't want to dismiss the horror it is for Palestinians, but it is an albatross for the Democrats. They can't get around it, because in the past wars had the effect of muting, at least up until Vietnam, but then with the Gulf Wars of muting polarization. Now it has the effect of deepening polarization and also deepening extremism at home.
Yeah, and this is a good segue, I think, into your new book, America. And in that book, you talk about, I guess, this different conception of rights. And so you're mentioning how wars have a way of kind of looking out, and then the frontier itself as well. This looking out is a way of kind of a safety valve for any pressure in the country of looking, let's say, at the, income inequality or, different social rights and things that people may want. Instead of doing that, they say, let's look out. Yeah. There's land available in the West. Let's go there. Or, let's put our anger towards this thing or whatever. And now that we've hit that limit, instead of, actually looking at those things here in this country, which could solve some of the anger and all that stuff, now we're focusing on the wall. We're focusing, like you said, on different things. So why... In the book, you talk about it, but why is there such a difference in the approach to rights in the United States versus the rest of Latin America?
Well,
That's a big question.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
So first,
let's start there.
First, let's set
Yeah.
up what we mean by the different kinds of rights. So there's different ways of talking about it, but for simplicity's sake, we can say that there's individual rights, or sometimes they're called political rights, and they reign in the United States. They're dominant in the United States, and it's the idea that a virtuous state restrains itself as much as possible. It allows the greatest room for individuals to pursue their activities and their interests, whether it be religion, whether it be property, whether it be economics, whether it be beliefs, right? The greatest area of liberty for the individual. So the state is to stand down and stand back and restrain itself. Thou shalt not, the state shall not. Then there's social rights or economic rights, and that requires a different conception of the state, a conception of the state that is more active, that its virtue resides not in its ability to restrain itself, but its ability to provide education, to provide healthcare, to provide a dignified life. These are more active rights or positive rights. And most of the world, and this isn't so much a question of socialism versus capitalism, because most of the world holds to some version of social rights. They believe social rights are legitimate. Certainly Europe does, and Europe is a capitalist society, but they're understood to exist kind of in a mutually supportive relationship. And for the longest time, and a good part of the world, especially coming out of World War II, this was a conception of democracy that was commonplace. The idea that socialism was not just mutually beneficial to political freedom, but that it actually fulfilled freedom. And that was actually that freedom, individual freedom, was actually dependent on some form of social security. And there's been a lot of ideological work done to sever that relationship. Nowhere more so than in the United States. The United States still holds almost alone among industrial nations. The United States committed to a version of individual rights. So when Bernie Sanders says that every other country in the world provides healthcare, or what he's saying is that other countries in the world have social rights and the United States doesn't. And this in some ways is it's what End of the Myth tries to explain. Right. Why what it is about the frontier and limitlessness that reinforces a commitment to individual rights.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, and also in your new book, it's also you track, I guess, the development of Latin America, I guess, to say, even though it's all America, and the United States of America, and the differences that have led to, I guess, a different way of approaching the world. Part of which is the frontier. Obviously.
Yeah. Part of the frontier, and America is a big book, and it starts with the Spanish conquest in the 1500s, and it comes forward to the present, and it does try to kind of, and one of the central organizing tensions is this distinction between individual rights and social rights, and Latin America as a kind of bastion and bearer of social rights, and the United States as an agent of individual rights, and looking at how they the tension between the two. And one of the arguments is trying to figure out where exactly this commitment to social rights, to a social democratic conception of democracy in Latin America comes from, and why it's so persistent and enduring despite all of the violence, and despite the fact that in many places it's not fulfilled, or the promise is almost filled, and then it's not fulfilled. The brutality of the Spanish Empire in its early years, in which something like 90% of the population out of 100 million people within a couple of generations would disappear, either from the dislocations and violence of the conquest, or from the enslavement, or from diseases. That violence provoked a very strong moral reaction among a small group of intellectuals, Catholic theologians and Dominican priests, who argue for the insistence on the equality of Native Americans, and began to question the legitimacy of the Spanish conquest, and question the right of the Spaniards to enslave either Africans or Native Americans. Now, these criticisms didn't necessarily allay the worst of the conquest, but Spanish Catholicism did make these questions that make Native Americans and enslaved Africans the kind of moral center of the conquest. There was no denial that the Spanish Empire ruled over a vast number of people. I mean, these were the people that were extracting the wealth for the Spanish Empire. They were getting the silver from the Potosi Mountains, that's in Bolivia, that became the world's first universal currency, the Spanish peso. But these people were also the moral center of the Spanish Empire because it's Catholicism.
Right.
Catholicism claimed to be universal. It claimed to be the bearer of world history and the agent of all of the wisdom of world history. And they had to somehow justify what they were doing.
Right.
There was no, in other words, there was no denial and
Right.
no evasion. Now, if you jump to the British and Anglo experience in North America, the whole project was founded on evasion and denial. You know, there's this great document that I cite in the book from the Virginia Company in 1609, where they call a meeting of the board holders of the Virginia Company, which is settling Plymouth. They're going to settle Plymouth and settling Jamestown. And they said, you know, should we put out a document, maybe justifying what we want, what we're doing? And they had a long debate, and the debate was all centered on what the Spaniards were arguing. And they said, look, the Spanish have been arguing, basically they said, the Spanish have been arguing about this for a century, and they still can't justify sovereignty or conquest or enslavement. Maybe it's better we don't say anything at all, you know? And that kind of evasion, that kind of intellectual evasion was also replicated in the social experience of English colonialism. When they arrived in North America, disease had wiped out most of the people on the Atlantic coastline where they settled. And
they claimed it was more empty.
It's empty land. It's empty land, you know. And so, you know, and the solipsism of the Puritans, in which they debated these theology, predestination, and whether God was happy with them or not happy with them, or whether one could be saved through good works or not, or if you were condemned to, you know, to hell, or whether you were graced by God's love from time beginning. All of these debates, Native Americans had nothing to do with them. They were, you know, Native Americans were on the fringes. You know, they were like shadow players in the wings of the stage. And that kind of not dealing with difference and not dealing with race and not dealing with the humanity of Native Americans is a through line in U.S. history. In the Spanish Empire, for all of the hypocrisy and all of the brutality and all the exploitation, there was at least a recognition. And the Spanish Empire created a kind of hierarchy. It still presumed to be universal, right? This was the Catholic Church, but it was a universalism that was organized with the recognition of difference. Right. And that I think is one of the intellectual and social origins of this distinction between an intense individuality of the United States and the sociality of Latin America.
There's also the idea that there was so many different countries in Latin America. There was that kind of when they got their independence from Spain, they were already a big group of countries in a way coming together rather than just one country, the United States of America. That's how they saw themselves. There was a quote in your book too where you said that Spanish nations were born in a litter. So they were socialized at an early age, whereas, you know, the U.S. was born by itself, thinking that it was special.
Yeah.
You know?
And this has an effect because the book is also an argument of Latin America's centrality in creating the liberal international order that's put into place with the United Nations in 1945 after the defeat of fascism, after World War II. What's called the rules-based order or the liberal international order, you know, the thing that Donald Trump is dismantling. So the United States in the 1770s comes into the world basically on the east coast of the North American continent, on a continent that it's found is imagined were empty or empty enough. I mean, obviously it wasn't. There was the Spaniards were there, Native Americans were there, the Creeks were there, the Cherokees were there, Choctaw were there. The Mexicans were there. But the founders of the United States pretty much knew and imagined and fantasized that their new nation would soon stretch from sea to sea, and they weren't wrong. By 1848, they were on the Pacific.
Yeah.
They Indian removal. They invaded Mexico. They took 55% of Mexican territory. They annexed Texas. And they were on the Pacific. They revitalized and rehabilitated the doctrine of conquest, the idea that war is legitimate and you got to keep what you got to take.
Yeah. Which I thought in the book is interesting as well, that Spain, after helping the colonists win the revolution,
they were like, oh no, what
they're
do we
like,
do?
oh no, they're coming after us next.
I know, Spain, because France goaded them into helping the colonists win independence, but then saying, what do we do? And that's the reason why they gave up Louisiana to France, because they didn't want to have to deal with the United States, but they couldn't get away. Then jump forward to 1820s when Spanish American states and Brazil become independent. And they become independent on what's imagined to be an all full up continent in which no area lacked sovereignty. Now, under the old rules of law, what would stop Argentina from doing what the United States did and say, we want the Pacific, and rolling over Chile and seizing Chile, or Chile doing that to Argentina? Spanish America had to figure out a new way of organizing themselves politically and internationally. And what, in effect, they became the world's first League of Nations, or United Nations, a community of nations, not empires. I mean, Europe was a community of empires, and Spanish America were bounded nations with no colonies and no imperial pretensions. They had to learn how to live with each other, and they came up with a set of principles, a rejection of the doctrine of conquest, a rejection of aggressive war, outlawing aggressive war, a recognition of the sovereignty, absolute sovereignty of nations, and more importantly, more kind of normatively, an idea that the international order shouldn't be organized around competition and dominance, right? This was a rejection of European balance of power, in which we have polities pushing their interests against the other, and hopefully you create stasis. Latin America said that will always lead to war, because eventually one will push too high, or an upstart nation will overthrow the whole thing. Latin America said you had to organize the international order around the presumption of cooperation and a sense that nations shared common interests.
Yeah.
All of those principles become the principles of the United Nations, right? You can almost transpose the way Latin America organized itself in the 1820s and 1830s to 1945, to the foundation of the United Nations. I mean, Latin America is they came into being a League of Nations, the United Nations. And
not to mention, going back to what we were talking about before, that also reflects in the society itself. This idea that we're all bound together. There was a great quote in the book, Jose Marti, when he says that a nation can't be. It's not a horse race.
Yes,
he's like we're actually all in the same harness together.
Yeah. Well, there was a strong sense of, this goes back to the question of sociality and what is the individual and individual rights. The first batch of Spanish American constitutions all affirmed individual rights, like the U.S. Constitution. But they also, drawing on the earlier critics of the conquest, so people like Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who was one of the main critics of the conquest, he countering those who said Native Americans weren't human. He said, no, it was the Spanish conquistadors that dehumanized themselves by casting off any social restraint and acting like wild animals, and setting themselves upon Native Americans like tigers, like jackals. And they basically turned themselves into animals. They dehumanized themselves. And there was this concept that there is no such thing as an individual without society. De las Casas, when he was making his case that Native Americans in the 1500s had rights. It wasn't based on individual rights. It was because they were gente. They were people lived in society. So jump forward a couple of hundred years and you have all of those early Spanish American constitutions that said, yes, we recognize individual rights, but there are limits. Individual rights have to be balanced against the good of society, because if there is no society, there are no individuals.
Right.
Individuality is dependent on the social context that makes individuality possible.
Right. And this goes to the thing you brought up in the end of Myth, where this myth of the frontier thesis, for example, where this idea that in Jacksonian ideals, where the individual goes first. In the United States, the individual kind of paves the way, the pioneer, he goes, and then the government follows. Yeah. Whereas in Latin America, it's the total reverse.
Yeah,
it's
totally reverse, or a balance, or, right. Yes, exactly. There is this idea that the pioneer, the individual is first, and then they create the conditions for civil society, trading, trust. Then the state comes. Yeah. And the state is only legitimate to the degree that they allow individual action to, and
it shouldn't get too involved, and it shouldn't get too much, know.
Which of course isn't true. The state was involved in in Westwood. I mean, you need the state to move out Indians, you
and
need
protect you,
to lay the railroads,
Okay, so to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, and I guess to loop it back around to what happened this past weekend and what's been happening the last few months, and even before that, to be honest, I guess, what role would you say that the different actions that, let's say, the United States has taken in different countries, Central America, in Mexico in the 1800s, in addition to the different, I guess, capitalistic ventures that have been taking place under NAFTA, under neoliberal IMF, all these different things. What role do you think these all play in what's happening now? And I guess what would happen if we did acknowledge these things and actually tried to, at least recognize that there was a hand that the United States has played in creating this? Yeah.
Well, the United States, there are different periods, and that's a big question, a big time period. But you can say that the United States often does create the crisis that then generates the outpouring of migrants or whatever.
The revolution, Mexican Revolution, in the early 1900s.
The Mexican Revolution is another example. I mean, after the Civil War in the United States, Mexico was the United States' first nation-building project. From U.S. finance from Boston to New York, U.S. corporations went into Mexico, and within, a couple of decades, Mexico was like a subsidiary of U.S. capital. U.S. capital owned unbelievable amounts of mining and railroads and electrical grids and trolleys and ports, and and it was and the revolution in 1910. And of course, all of this and the building out of agro-industry and agriculture for export to the United States, which dispossessed peasants, Native Mexicans, and dispossessed them, and they lost their land. The Mexican Revolution in 1910 was a reaction to this dislocations of that system, and it was really the first third world revolution against industrial capitalism and its enabling myths. And particularly myths surrounding the sanctity of foreign investment. So yes, there's a long history of this, but if we just go back to Central America and think about the Central America, I mean, now migrants are coming from everywhere because the U.S. has, what the U.S. has done in Libya, and then the overthrow of the NATO's bombing of and overthrow of Gaddafi. Radicalized Northern Africa, and Northern Africa there's a lot of ways in which the global war on terror created a new crisis of statelessness. To be more contained, we can just look at Central America, and we can look at the United States funded these vicious anti-communist wars in Central America in the 1970s and 1980s. Whether it be the Contras in Nicaragua or the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, created massive migration. tended to treat Nicaraguans because Nicaraguans were fleeing a communist regime that the United States was opposed to, the Sandinistas, not too badly. They treated them maybe not as well as the Cubans, but better than the Salvadorans and Guatemalans because they were fleeing Allied regimes.
Right.
The Salvadorans and Guatemalans they threw into penitentiaries in LA where the gangs were created.
MS-13,
Where MS-13 and the whole networks were created. And this is why you don't have major gang problems in Nicaragua. Yeah. Maybe you're starting to have it now, but
people don't realize that MS-13 came from the United States back into El Salvador.
Back into El Salvador, and then Guatemala, and so there's that cycle of radicalization that the United States is responsible for. Yeah. There's that then after the Cold War was over, there was the United States pushing economic private liberalization. Pushing African palm, the liberalization of mining, which created more dispossession. That led to more migration into the United States. Bill Clinton's other Latin American policy, we've already talked about NAFTA, we've talked about militarization of the border. His third major Latin American policy was Plan Colombia. It's beginning the pouring of billions of dollars to militarize the drug war in the Andes even further. That had the effect of breaking up, not really touching production that much, but breaking up the transportation cartels. No more coming in. No more the end of the Miami Vice years. The end of the coming in through Florida and the opening up of routes overland through Mexico and Central America, which led to the rise of the cartels and gangs. And also, if you destroy all the large cartels, and you leave and you create this vacuum, it creates a premium on violence for new groups trying to get into the game. And this is utterly devastating for Guatemala and for El Salvador and for Honduras and for Mexico. And so you're seeing the refugees from that wave of dispossession. So there's layers upon layers of dispossession which of U.S. generated and provoked dispossession of people trying to make it into the United States in order to survive. At the same time, you have the militarization of the border, and it makes them harder to leave when they want to leave. So they're trapped in here. So then it becomes a domestic problem. As it becomes more of a problem, politicians begin to offer solutions, and the solutions are always the same. If they always talk about we need some version of sometimes they use the word Marshall Plan, sometimes they use the word Alliance for Progress, but we have to spend more on Central America, but they want to spend more on the things that are causing the dispossession in the first place.
And that's one of the newer things.
So they fund more African palm plantations, they fund more mega dams, they fund more things that lead to the destruction of peasant economies. Or they fund military and policing, right? Because they want to outsource the securitization, but that has the effect in countries like Guatemala and Mexico and Salvador, funding basically the cartels and the gangsters because there's a lot of overlap between the two. So it's really a perpetual motion machine that goes by itself.
Not to mention the aid that comes in the form of loans that are tied to passing austerity measures, to privatizing national industries and all those things, which further makes life more difficult in Latin America as well.
Yeah, it's quite staggering when one considers the inability of U.S. policymakers to confront the problem, honestly.
Yeah, and then we go back to what we were talking about earlier with this individualistic way of looking at things. It kind of becomes an us versus them, as opposed to the way Latin America looks at things. And it's a total mess, really. And there have been moments in American history where the United States hasn't necessarily embraced this kind of frontier as the safety valve or whatever, and actually looked inward to let's say, addressing social rights and things like that. Like, for example, in the 1930s, the New Deal, even leading into World War II with, Henry Wallace, kind of embracing these social rights, taking trips to Latin America and being greeted as this kind of almost like a brother in a certain way. And then after World War II, there was really kind of, that's where the fork in the road. It was between, Henry Wallace's way of looking at things and continuing this kind of New Deal mentality, and Harry Truman and what we know now is like the anti-communist Cold War mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, Latin America spent a good part of the 19th century trying to get the United States to reject the doctrine of conquest and to reject the right of intervention. And the United States refused and refused and refused until it didn't. Until 1933, after the Great Depression with FDR in the White House, at a Pan-American conference, the United States basically accepted every provision that Latin America demanded. They accepted the abrogation of the right of the doctrine of conquest. They gave up the right of intervention, and they said they would recognize the absolute sovereignty of Latin American nations, no matter what their size, in the domestic and foreign affairs of every nation. The headline in the New York Times was, the age of imperialism is over. FDR was hailed as a kind of unconquering hero in Latin America, and it really did change the game. It created an enormous period of goodwill between, I'd say, 1933 to 1947, 1948. In which the United States and Latin America converged to a large degree. There were reformers in Latin America of different stripes that all adopted the idea that they were doing a Latin American version of the New Deal, even if they started their reform period before FDR did. Mm-hmm. But so there was a kind of continental-wide New Deal. Mm-hmm. And we all know the phrase, the good neighbor policy, which kind of signals, a kind of respect that FDR would pay to Latin America. But the phrase good neighbor, what people don't know, was also used in FDR's 1936 re-election campaign. Good neighbor leagues were basically his get out the vote. The New Deal was in trouble during the first term. The right was on the rise. Liberty leagues were formed that were kind of proto-fascist, that were putting forward a Saxon white supremacist version of citizenship. And some of the reforms of the New Deal had stalled. And FDR created these good neighbor leagues as a way of kind of getting out the vote. And they were interesting because they were a way of reconciling foreign and domestic policy. So to the degree that the good neighbor policy was a way of recognizing the diversity of Latin American understanding of what America is, FDR famously said, "Your Americanism and mine, is equal." The Good Neighbor Leagues was a way of projecting that kind of tolerance to in the domestic realm. Mm-hmm. So Good Neighbor Leagues were used to organize blacks in the North, in Chicago, in the South, ethnic groups in the cities, Native Americans on reservations, Latinos. And it was a kind of new ethos of social citizenship that was put forward. To a large degree, it was this kind of alliance with Latin America and this internationalization of the New Deal, which helped stabilize the New Deal at home. And Roosevelt won re-election by an enormous landslide. He won 27 million votes. He won more votes than any human being ever won in any election, and he won it on largely a social democratic campaign. Mm-hmm. And the very first thing he did after winning was he went to Buenos Aires. And he did a victory lap around Latin America, and he began to organize the Latin America for the coming fight against fascism. Mm-hmm. And he clearly signaled that the United States would tolerate economic nationalism, it would tolerate socialism, it would tolerate social democracy, and it would side with the left against the right. Mm-hmm. And it did. And that made all the difference in the world, because geostrategists were worried. Their biggest fear was that Latin America would turn into the Spanish Civil War on a continent level. Because there's a lot of the same kind of sociological determinants with Spain and Latin America. You had large landowners, you had a servile peasant class, you had conservative Catholicism, you had patricians that were all fighting against social liberalization. Mm-hmm. And Franco won there, and he allied with Hitler and he allied with Mussolini. geostrategists aligned with FDR were afraid that would happen on a continent-wide thing. And if it did, the United States would be isolated in its own hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And so people like Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president during his third term, was very active in Latin America, going around. I mean, he toured. Many people assumed that Roosevelt wouldn't run for a fourth term. They thought they were talking to the next president of the United States. And Wallace kept on saying, Wallace had a very capacious vision of what fascism was. He said, we're not going to beat it on the battlefield. Unless we raise the wages of the world's workers, fascism will break out again and again and again. And he went to Latin America and he promised them aid, and he wrote into procurement contracts labor clauses which insisted on a minimum wage, which insisted on health care, which insisted on all of these social provisions. And
for the war, you're saying, for World War II.
During the war.
And contracts for World War II.
It made him enormously popular in Latin America, but it basically tilted the field to the left against the right. And by 1944-45, all of Latin America was basically governed by social democratic governments. That didn't last long, because the U.S. switches from supporting the left against the right to supporting the right against the left in the Cold War. And
he doesn't get the nomination.
He doesn't get the nomination.
Mostly because of the things he was saying.
I make the argument it has to do, a lot of it had to do with what he was doing in Latin America. He alienated the right wing of the Democratic Party by going around telling Latin Americans that they were going to get, public capital to invest and diversify their industries.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that the American, fight during World War II was really an American fight. Like it was South America. It was all really united. The raw materials came in to the United States. The United States shipped out, and it was really like a team effort.
Yeah, Brazil, that part of Brazil that
juts out.
Roosevelt called it the trampoline of the Atlantic. Non-stop flights to Northern Africa, getting material and men into the European theater and North African theater. And more than that, Latin America becomes a model. FDR holds it up as a model for what the world will look like after World War II.
And a model because for the UN.
And again, Latin Americans thought that they weren't just fighting against fascism. They thought they were fighting for social democracy, as did many people in the world.
Yeah. And then, unfortunately, after the war,
the Cold War,
the U.S. makes an about face, and they're like, "Wait, what happened? You guys told us you were going to help us out with the right," and then the U.S. kind of basically, oh boy. But okay, well, there is some hope there, I guess. To wrap this kind of up, I guess with everything going on now, and what we can all. What gives you hope with what's happening now? Where do you see, an in or some kind of place to possibly affect a positive change to this outlook?
Well, I think that Latin America is a source of hope and inspiration. I think that it's precarious. I mean, people are poor. There's violence. The right is on the rise, and it's kind of animated by this new spirit of Trumpism and a lot of the cultural warfare tactics of Trumpism, perpetual polarization and whatnot. There's still, the drug violence. But Latin Americans continue to organize, and they continue to elect social democrats. I mean, Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, the granddaughter of Jewish communist refugees from Europe, is sitting in the Mexican viceroy's office. He was the most powerful office of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And, basically his job was to keep Jews out. One of his jobs. And there she is, Claudia Sheinbaum.
Cool.
And she has 85% approval rating. But aside from elected governments, the social movements on the ground, I mean, part of my book is looking at how humanization emerges out of dehumanization. And Latin America, well, more environmental activists are killed in Latin America than any other region in the world in any given year. And yet environmental activism doesn't stop, right? And the same thing can be said about trans rights, about feminism, about labor activists, journalists, and the commitment. And even Latin American nationalism, where other countries that suffered the kind of depredations of neoliberalism and economic globalization have embraced a kind of conspiratorial, nasty, xenophobic nationalism, whether we're talking about Hungary or Turkey or the Philippines. That's not really the case in Latin America. Nationalism in Latin America is still a stepping stone towards universalism, right? They still understand, like, Latin America is really the last region in the world that takes the Enlightenment that continues to take the Enlightenment at its word in many ways.
Nice. That's well said. That's a good segue into reminding people, and we're gonna wrap this up here in a second. But it's a good segue into reminding people you got to get this book. It's called America by Greg Grandin. New History of the New World. Not to mention the end of the myth. Or the end of the myth is the Pulitzer Prize-winning one. Pretty big deal. Congratulations on that. A little bit delayed, but pretty great. I guess one last question. Since we're here, you mind giving me the old autograph, a little old John Hancock on there?
Will do.
Yeah, it's a weathered copy now. I've underlined it, and I did read it. Unlike many interviewers, I did read it. But thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
It's really great conversation.
And thank you guys. If you guys did enjoy the conversation, I have the link to Greg's books in the description. All that. You really got to check these books out. It's more important now than ever to kind of know what's going on and inform yourselves correctly. But I don't know. I guess that's kind of it, Greg. Do you got anything else you want to say or any questions?
No, I think
we covered everything. I think we solved everything.
We solved everything.
We solved everything here today, in Brooklyn. But thank you so much, Greg, and I guess thank you guys. Thank you guys for watching. See y'all later.